December 31st, 1961, 11:45 p.m. Times Square was packed with 300 people celebrating New Year's Eve. 5 different gangs had cornered Bumpy Johnson in the heart of the crowd. 15 minutes later, Bumpy walked out alone. This is the story of the most impossible escape in criminal history. How one man survived a coordinated attack by 50 armed enemies in the middle of America's most famous intersection without harming a single innocent bystander. When the ball dropped at midnight, Times Square had one less problem, but the NYPD was left with a mystery they'd never solve. To understand how Bumpy Johnson ended up surrounded by 5 gangs in Times Square on New Year's Eve 1961, you need to understand what had been happening in New York's criminal underworld throughout that year. Bumpy's victory over Frank Costello on Brooklyn Bridge in 1956 had established him as the most powerful independent criminal in New York. But independence came with a price. Every ambitious gang in the city saw him as a target. By 1961, 5 separate criminal organizations had formed an alliance specifically to eliminate Bumpy Johnson. Unlike the 7 Families Alliance of 1955, this was a more sophisticated coalition with better planning and more resources. The 5 Boroughs Alliance included the Bronx Bombers, led by Carlos the Hammer Rodriguez, the Queens Connection, controlled by Michael Icepick Murphy, the Brooklyn Brotherhood, headed by Vincent Vinny Knives Torino, the Staten Island Syndicate, run by Tommy the Torch Castellano, and the Lower East Side Lions, commanded by Samuel Sammy Guns Goldstein. Each organization brought different strengths to the alliance. The Bronx Bombers had explosives expertise. The Queens Connection controlled drug trafficking routes. The Brooklyn Brotherhood had political connections. The Staten Island Syndicate owned dock workers. The Lower East Side Lions had financial resources. Together, they represented over 200 armed criminals with one shared goal: divide Bumpy Johnson's Harlem territory among themselves. Their plan was elegant in its simplicity. They would corner Bumpy in a public place where he couldn't use his usual defensive tactics, somewhere with enough civilian presence that he couldn't risk a firefight, somewhere he'd have to surrender or face responsibility for innocent casualties. Times Square on New Year's Eve was perfect. The plan began on December 30th, when each gang sent representatives to monitor Bumpy's movements. They discovered he'd planned to attend the New Year's Eve celebration in Times Square with a small group of associates, believing the public setting would protect him from assassination attempts. They were about to prove him wrong. December 31st, 1961, 11:45 p.m. Times Square was electric with celebration. 300 people had gathered to watch the ball drop, creating the perfect crowd for Bumpy to disappear into. Street vendors sold noisemakers and champagne. Musicians played on corners. Everyone was focused on the approaching midnight countdown. Bumpy Johnson arrived with 3 associates: Illinois Gordon Jr., son of his murdered friend, Quick Lewis, and a new lieutenant named Marcus Smooth Henderson. They positioned themselves near the TKTS booth, giving them good visibility of the crowd and multiple escape routes. That's when Bumpy realized they'd walked into a trap. At 11:47 p.m., he spotted Carlos Rodriguez positioning men around the northern exits. At 11:48 p.m., he saw Michael Murphy's crew blocking the southern approaches. By 11:49 p.m., all 5 gangs had 47 armed men scattered throughout the crowd, creating a human cage with Bumpy at the center. "Boss," Quick Lewis whispered, "we're surrounded." Bumpy studied the crowd, calculating odds and options. 300 innocent civilians, 47 enemy gunmen, 4 defenders, in the middle of the most famous intersection in America, with police nearby and national news cameras rolling. "How do you want to play this?" Illinois Gordon Jr. asked. Bumpy's response would become legendary. "We don't play, we work." At 11:50 p.m., 10 minutes before midnight, the war began. But this wasn't going to be a traditional gunfight. Bumpy understood something his enemies didn't. In a crowd of 300 people, the man who could blend in had a massive advantage over men who had to coordinate attacks. The 5 Boroughs Alliance's plan assumed Bumpy would try to fight his way out, creating chaos they could exploit. Instead, He disappeared into the crowd like smoke. At 11:51 p.m., Carlos Rodriguez gave the signal for his men to close in. When they reached the spot where Bumpy had been standing 30 seconds earlier, they found 3 confused tourists asking for directions to the subway. Bumpy Johnson had vanished. But he hadn't left Times Square. He was using the crowd the same way a submarine uses the ocean, as camouflage, concealment, and strategic advantage. While 47 gunmen searched frantically for their target, Bumpy was moving through the crowd systematically, eliminating threats one by one with precision that bordered on surgical. The first target was a Brooklyn Brotherhood soldier positioned near the Reuters building. The man was found unconscious behind a hot dog cart at 11:52 p.m., his weapon missing. No one in the crowd saw what happened. The second target was a Queens Connection gunman covering the western exits. At 11:53 p.m., he simply vanished from his position. His body was discovered in a maintenance closet 3 hours later. By 11:55 p.m., 5 minutes before midnight, 8 members of the Five Boroughs Alliance had been neutralized without a single civilian noticing anything unusual. The New Year's celebration continued around them, unaware that a war was being fought in their midst. But the real genius of Bumpy's strategy wasn't just elimination, it was psychological warfare. As Alliance members realized their colleagues were disappearing, they began to panic. Men who'd been confident predators became nervous prey, jumping at shadows and suspicious of everyone around them. At 11:56 p.m., Michael Murphy tried to regroup his remaining men, but half of them had lost visual contact with their targets. The sophisticated coordination of the Five Boroughs Alliance was breaking down into confusion and fear. That's when Bumpy revealed the second phase of his strategy. Instead of continuing to hide in the crowd, he began using the civilians as unwitting shields and distractions. When Alliance gunmen tried to take positions for clear shots, they found themselves blocked by celebrating families. When they attempted to communicate with hand signals, tourists with cameras interrupted their sightlines. The crowd that was supposed to trap Bumpy Johnson became his personal army of 300 unknowing bodyguards. At 11:57 p.m., Vincent Torino made a fatal mistake. Frustrated by his inability to locate Bumpy, he drew his weapon in full view of the crowd, thinking he could force a confrontation. Instead, he created exactly the situation Bumpy had been waiting for. The moment Torino's gun became visible, nearby civilians began screaming and running. The panic spread through the crowd like wildfire, creating the chaos that Bumpy needed to finish the job. In the 3 minutes between 11:57 p.m. and midnight, the organized attack by the Five Boroughs Alliance completely collapsed. Samuel Goldstein's men were separated and confused by the panicking crowd. Tommy Castellano lost half his soldiers in the chaos. Carlos Rodriguez found himself alone and exposed, unable to coordinate with anyone. At 11:59 p.m., 1 minute before midnight, Bumpy Johnson emerged from the crowd, 30 feet from where he'd started, holding a Thompson submachine gun that had belonged to one of his eliminated attackers. The 5 gang leaders, Rodriguez, Murphy, Torino, Castellano, and Goldstein, found themselves facing the man they'd thought was trapped, while their own soldiers were scattered, confused, and outnumbered by panicking civilians. "Gentlemen," Bumpy announced, his voice carrying over the noise of the crowd, "you wanted to have a New Year's conversation. Let's talk." The countdown began. 10, 9, 8. Carlos Rodriguez reached for his weapon. He never completed the draw. 7, 6, 5. Michael Murphy tried to signal his remaining men. They were too busy running from the crowd to respond. 4, 3, 2. Vincent Torino, Tommy Castellano, and Samuel Goldstein looked around at the chaos they'd created and realized they'd made the same mistake every criminal who'd underestimated Bumpy Johnson had made. 1. Happy New Year! At exactly midnight on January 1st, 1962, as fireworks exploded over Times Square and 300 people cheered the new year, the Five Boroughs Alliance ceased to exist. When police arrived to investigate reports of gunfire in Times Square, they found a very confusing scene. 5 men were unconscious or wounded near the TKTS booth. Several weapons were scattered around the area. but none of the 300 witnesses could provide a coherent description of what had happened. It was chaos, one tourist told investigators. People were running everywhere. There was screaming, but I never saw any actual fighting. I heard some pops that might have been gunshots, another witness reported. But it could have been firecrackers. It was New Year's Eve, you know? The NYPD report concluded. Disturbance in Times Square during New Year's celebration. Multiple individuals injured in apparent altercation. Witnesses unable to provide coherent accounts due to crowd conditions and celebratory atmosphere. No arrests were made. No charges were filed. The most sophisticated criminal ambush in New York history officially became a New Year's Eve disturbance. But in the criminal underworld, everyone knew exactly what had happened. Bumpy Johnson had been cornered by 50 armed enemies in the middle of Times Square and had turned their trap into their defeat. The aftermath of the Times Square incident sent a clear message throughout New York's criminal community. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just untouchable because of his power or his organization. He was untouchable because he could think 3 moves ahead of anyone who tried to kill him. Federal investigators who studied the incident were baffled by the tactical sophistication Bumpy had demonstrated. Subject showed ability to use civilian population as tactical advantage while avoiding collateral casualties, their report noted. This suggests military training or exceptional tactical intelligence. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Times Square incident wasn't the tactical brilliance Bumpy displayed. It was the fact that despite 15 minutes of urban warfare involving 54 armed men, not a single civilian was seriously injured. Bumpy Johnson had proven something that night that would become part of his legend. Even in the most desperate circumstances, he maintained a code that protected innocent people. The Five Boroughs Alliance never reformed. The surviving members returned to their individual territories, wiser but poorer for their experience. None of them ever again attempted to coordinate against Bumpy Johnson. Times Square returned to normal the next day, with tourists and locals completely unaware that they'd witnessed one of the most sophisticated criminal operations in American history. But for Bumpy Johnson, December 31st, 1961, became the night that proved his reputation wasn't just based on violence or intimidation. It was based on the kind of strategic thinking that could turn any situation, no matter how impossible, into victory. This is the story of 15 minutes that proved intelligence beats numbers, strategy beats coordination, and one smart man in a crowd of 300 can defeat 50 enemies who think they have him trapped. If this story of tactical brilliance, impossible odds, and the most creative escape in criminal history amazed you, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who appreciates that sometimes the best weapon is your environment and your brain. And in the comments, let me know, could this really have happened, or is it just an impossible legend? Next week, we're revealing the classified NYPD files on this incident that police tried to explain away for 60 years. You won't want to miss that.